Besser Wissen, der Podcast von golem.de. My name is Martin Wolf and I'm the official podcast representative of golem.de. This podcast is the English original version of a talk with Richard Eske about his TRS-80. We made a translated version with a machine learning tool. This German version is available on the same platforms as this podcast. It will be linked in the show notes as well. My guest, Richard Eske, agreed to this experimental translation. Hello and welcome to another episode. Yeah, which is it's strange for me to say this in English, and I still haven't come to terms with that. There's 2 episodes that are in English as of right now. There's one about a Soviet computer with Eugene, and the one we are recording right now. Richard Eske, thank you for coming here. And the point is, Richard, just so you know, because you don't speak German, so you didn't listen to this podcast, but I always start the podcast with saying, my name is that, and I'm the Podcastbeauftragte of golem.de, and I should be an English translation for that, but I'm not sure if this is going to be a standard that we are doing English podcasts, so I'll give this to future Martin to take care of. Richard, thank you for coming to my office and to talk about the TRS-80. I met you at VCFB, which is the Vintage Computer Festival Berlin, a couple of weeks ago, and I immediately I was drawn to your desk when I saw this gray computer with something that looked like a TV as a monitor. And I knew it is a TRS-80, but as it is usually the case in Europe, I don't know much about it. So where did you, or how did you get to see your first TRS-80 in a house? What's the story behind it?
My first TRS-80 actually it would be the bigger one that was there. So I had 3 TRS-80s there. There was the Model 1 and the Model 3, and then the Model 100 that I have. I also have another one that would be the Coco 2, or the Color Computer 2, that is also labeled as a TRS-80. But that one actually is having problems, so I did not bring it. But the TRS-80 that you're describing is the TRS-80 Model 1, and its monitor is a black and white TV.
And then is this computer actually the one that you got back then, or did you have one? So how did you start computing?
Oh, I started computing with a real computer would be a Commodore 64. That would be my first actual computer. I've used Apple IIs in the past, but that was for the classroom. And I've used consoles, or I should say I've played on video game consoles, the Atari 2600. So I'm dating myself.
You do, but I played on the Atari 2600 as well, and it was not in the 70s. That's what I can say. So we're talking, I think, about the 80s? Or
yeah.
Yeah. So one thing I have to say, you're from the US.
Yes.
I mean, we have to say,
yes, I am
this right. There is a difference.
Yeah, ich komme auf den US.
You started computing in the 80s in US, but where did it take you from there?
A lot of places in the United States. First, it was computing in California. Then I moved to New Mexico. It's a southwestern state, and then from there, or I should say, while I was there in New Mexico State, I lived there for about many years, and I graduated with a computer science degree. And then moved up to Seattle, and I've worked with multiple companies all the way through. So back in New Mexico, I actually worked at Intel as a computer technician and network guy. And then in Seattle, I actually worked for backup administration with Amazon. And then I worked as Azure support, so doing cloud computing for Microsoft directly. Well, in the sense, I shouldn't say directly, as a contractor. So another company contracted my services to Microsoft. I still was on Microsoft territory, property, doing Microsoft's work directly.
So, and it says in your LinkedIn, which I'll put in the show notes, of course, a seasoned Linux administrator with strong DevOps automation with Ansible and Python.
Yep.
I understand the words with, and with. Okay, I know what Linux is and I know what an administrator does, but DevOps, Ansible, and okay, Python. I know what Python is. It's a snake, of course.
Ansible is a configuration tool or configuration language. And DevOps is development operations. And the idea is to have the ability to automate deploying computers or changing computers. So you have a company that has multiple, say 500 servers doing your work, but you want to change that to something else. Instead of doing each and every server to a specific point, you have programs to do that. So you have Ansible. Ansible then reaches out to all those computers and changes their configuration programmatically, where you actually just tell it to do its thing, and it does it.
So I certainly heard DevOps before, but I never dared to ask what it is. Thank you for telling me. And also, you're at the moment you're looking for work as well.
Yeah. I am so seasoned professional. While I would say that I can understand some Deutsch, it's like I would not. Aber ich kann sprechen etwas Deutsch. Mein Deutsch ist nicht toll. Aber ich lerne mehr Deutsch und ich kann die das verstehen.
To be at least verstehen, which is already 50%. No, it's not 50% of the way there. I think for English-speaking people, that's a big hurdle to take. So there's a reason why we do this podcast in English from now on. Did you start collecting when you were still in the US?
Okay, that's one of the more expensive parts about moving to the US.
I reckon that would be not so cheap. So you brought the TRS-80. It's a US American.
It is a US.
Okay.
I was running a transformer while I was at the Berlin Festival. I was using a large 1,000 or 2,000 watt transformer, and that I was powering everything on. Luckily, those computers were able to handle the 50 hertz that normally happen in Europe.
That's a thing that I think sometimes we don't really appreciate the stuff we have right now. I never have to care about anything of that anymore at all. Yeah. If I go to the US, I just take my usual stuff with me, and I have a plug that adapts the other one.
Most plugs these days have that ability to switch from the high voltage to the low voltage automatically. So even the smallest plug for your phone, a power adapter, is already set for that, and all you have to do is just change the way that it's plugged in.
Yeah. So let's get back to the 80s.
Sure.
You had a C64, which I always thought that the C64 was not that common in the US, but
it was very common. It was one of the big ones. It was considered if not the biggest, it was one of the biggest in the 80s. The Atari had the 400 and 800, and that was big, but it was starting to fall away a little bit. And then the Commodore VIC opened up cheap computers, and then the Commodore 64 just pretty much threw that door open. Apples were too expensive to be completely a game machine or a machine that you would give your kid, but a Commodore was in that nice price point where you could do that.
as you're saying that, I remember that's right. There was a commercial with William Shatner
Yes.
of Star Enterprise fame, who praised the VIC-20 as the wonder computer of the 80s. I guess that was
When it first came out in 1980, it was considered that way because it was one of the first computers with actual graphics, this colored graphics, cheap.
But we'll go back 3 years. That is 1977. There is the so-called 1977 Trinity, which is comprised of the Apple II, the TRS-80, and the Commodore PET.
Okay.
So, if you could choose, which one would you? If right now,
If I choose, I like the fact that the Apple had the high graphics. You would have to put a lot more effort for the PET. The PET actually, I think, didn't have any type of graphics outside of the alphanumeric, and the TRS-80 had very blocky graphics, and also it was only 2 colors, while the Apple had 16 or 6. So it was more expensive, but it also did more.
It did. And this Trinity, in a way, it started, the kick-started the home computer revolution, because these 3 were the first ones that came assembled and were ready to purchase in
Yes.
like a shop, a normal store.
Yes.
I mean, of course,
You did not
store,
have
but
to fiddle with any type of selections. You did not have to fiddle with ROM chips or any type you didn't have to install, and you did not have to make them. You did not have to actually solder them up, which the other ones you did if you wanted to save money, or you had to pay extra to have someone else do it for you.
So the other 2, we can cover the Apple II and the PET, which are like if I go by looks, I would say the PET, but on the other hand, the TRS-80 has a very distinct look. I would say it's special. So, but we'll stick with the TRS-80.
Sure.
Do you know the backstory? I mean, TRS stands for Tandy Radio Shack, which is already
beforehand. I know that Tandy Tanning Company got into with Radio Shack first, so they bought the electronic company Radio Shack, and worked with the distribution of electronics. And then as technology advanced into the 70s, they saw an opportunity to put a lot of those off-the-shelf components into a computer. Because computers at the time of 1970, 1975, when they probably started to actually look into it, they probably saw that, we could probably do this. And then since they were already a company with resources, they could do it relatively cheaply. And that's what the big push for the TRS-80 Model 1 was. It was cheap. It was far cheaper. I think it was like half the cost of a...
We'll come to the numbers. I have them here.
Okay.
Richard. No, we'll come to the juicy numbers. We'll come to them. But, okay, Radio Shack is a name that even for someone who's not fluent in English or whatever, it's a strange name. I mean, what even is a Radio Shack? And it turns out a Radio Shack is where the radio is at. The ham radio guys, mostly guys, I presume.
Yeah.
In the early years of radio, like in the 20s or whatever, there was a growing scene of amateur radio people, and they were catered to by this company, which called itself after what they said where their radio station is, which is the Radio Shack. So everybody knew, okay, this is where I can get my electronics fix, whatever it is. And then, as you said, Tandy bought them, and Tandy was a leather tanning corporation.
Yep.
It is a bit strange to have
Yes,
this.
it is.
To have this, because I'm sure you know that there's another leather company with their hands in microelectronics, which is Coleco.
Yeah.
Is that normal in the US that leather companies start dabbling into
don't know.
microelectronics?
I honestly don't know. But yeah, after thinking about it, that is kind of interesting that you would have two leather companies get into electronics about the same time and then produce computers.
It is strange. And neither of their computers has a leather finish. Well, that's a mystery.
That is kind of.
I mean, that could have been so nice. I mean,
I think they wanted to keep the prices down, so I think having extra $100 in the leather, there might have also been heat issues.
I don't know. Yeah, we'll never find out. But what we can find out is the story behind the TRS-80. There is a funny story about the way they introduced it to the higher ups. Do you know about this? How it came to be?
Not entirely, no.
There is. I did some research before this podcast, and I found this story about how they one of the sales, or no, not the sales guys. What's the opposite? What's the if you have like
a researcher?
No, if you have like such a big electronics, I don't know, chain, they have like a person that looks into stuff that is to buy. Yeah, the buyer.
Buyer.
Okay, so it's that easy. There's one of those buyers, and he's meeting with other people, and then they go, yeah, wouldn't that be nice to have a computer kit? So, because they saw that this is a thing in the Homebrew Computer Club, which was a thing then. And there was one of those homebrew guys called Steve Leininger, who obviously was very talented in developing like ideas for turning this into a real product. Because there's one thing to say, okay, we are like an electronics chain and we can do all that. We have the parts, but you have to have the knowledge to put this together. And he said that wouldn't it be nice to have like a computer that isn't a kit, that is all put together already.
That was the trend in the late 70s.
And they did with not a lot of money. There is one number, and it is $150,000 for like the development of the whole computer, which is astonishingly low.
But yeah, I remember millions being stories of millions being sent to Atari for its 2600. Millions, so much so that they actually had to get investment from Time Warner for the Atari 2600 because they needed that much research. To see that the TRS-80, I knew it felt like the TRS-80 came across as something cobbled together and thrown, oddly enough, similar to the original IBMs, actually, because those were very much just throw them together and then have a BIOS. But that's essentially what happened here, I could see, is that they had a very simple, they had a Z80 memory, in this case, I think 4 kilobytes of total for the first, a very basic ROM, and that could fit, and then just put it into a plastic case.
And they had the means of production, which Atari probably didn't have in that, or I mean, they had probably all the components that they needed already on shelves.
Yeah.
Which Atari didn't have. They have to buy
they
everything.
Would have to buy.
But when Radio Shack probably had, which brings us to the monitor, which is that's a good point, how they used already existing technology that they had to put this computer together, because the monitor was just a TV.
Yeah.
Without the tuner.
Yeah, I actually opened up the one that I had. I recently picked up the power supply to it. So at that festival, or at that meetup, was really the first time I turned it on and left it on for any length of time. I did open it up and dust out that TV, and looked at it, make sure that the capacitors didn't have any issues or anything like that. It was just, but that would be the first time. It's like, and it handled itself very well. But I could see where a tuner would be, because they had the cutouts for the dials in the back in the in those times you had full dials to turn on, and so you had the volume control, and then you had the dial, and then maybe you would use UV,
UHF.
yeah, UHF and so forth.
Yeah.
And you would have to kind of click to the right one.
Yeah. If you know what to look for, you'll see it, because we'll link a picture of one in the show notes, of course. You'll see that the actual screen is not centered, which is very unusual for a computer screen, because there's no reason to not make it centered. But if it's a TV, which has obviously a speaker on the right or the left side, in this case on the right side, then it's not centered. So yeah, we'll put that in the show notes.
Even in the 70s, actually, black and white TVs were a commodity, and they were very cheap because the electronics were simple. The color TVs were in force, but you could, with a simple black and white screen, you can make the computer, and that's essentially what they did.
So we're still in the 70s, and
Sure.
the construction, the project TRS-80 is underway. So it was greenlit, and they put it all together, and they had do you know the story about the presentation to the higher ups?
Must have been interesting.
It is. They showed it to Charles David Tandy.
Okay, so one of the attendees.
And that was, as the name suggests, it's like one of the bosses of the corporations. And they showed it with then tax accounting program, because it should have some use. I mean, they wouldn't show a game to this guy, but everybody's got to do their taxes. So and one of the points, of course, is you have to enter your salary, which he did, which led the program to crash, because the salary was over 150,000. It was 16-bit integer. And they asked him, okay, it's okay to earn that much money, but for the computer, it would be good if you could only have 32,000 a year of income. So which he agreed not to have that less income, but he agreed to type it in. And then it worked, and they got it out the door. I don't know where this anecdote is from. I'll try to put a link in the description. I'm not sure if it's accurate, but it's very nice. And I mean,
it sounds interesting.
Yeah, it does.
Because
they were estimating how many computers will they sell. I mean, there was no precedent to that.
Yeah. In the 1970s. Especially if it was 77, there's no precedent, because those three in the original Triumphant, that was it. Because I think Atari's computers came out in 1979. So these three were it. These were the first three.
So they thought, I mean, the guys who French was the one. One was called Mr. French. He was from Radio Shack, and the Line Ninja was the one who came from the Homebrew Computer Club. And they were very optimistic. They said we could do 50,000, but the executives thought, nah, come on, 1,000 to 3,000. That is what we settled.
Okay.
Then one of them told them, okay, so let's do 3,500, because that is the amount of stores we have. So even if they're not sold, the store can use them for accounting, which would be good, wouldn't it be? So they said, okay, we'll do. Now, what happened was that 15,000 people in the first days after the announcement called Radio Shack to purchase a TRS-80. The whole telephone line went went blacked out.
I could see that. That could be funny. And definitely
in the first 1.5 months, they sold over 10,000 and over 200,000 during the product's lifetime, which is quite a lot for that for this time, I think.
For the 1970s, because that's Apple II numbers. Is in that realm. If you're selling hundreds of thousands, that's what the Apple II.
Now, that's the part where I go with the numbers. Now, the TRS-80 at first, the price for a kit, they obviously they had like a kit, but it was not expected that many people buy it. It was $399, which is $2,000 today. the normal one with the monitor and the tape recorder, which is,
Yep.
of course, necessary to get data
Yes.
in and out of this thing, was $599, which is $3,116.59 in today's, which is, we have November 24, which would, in Germany, have amounted to over 7,000 Deutschmarks.
Oof.
And so you can immediately see why it took so long for Germany to catch up with computers. The exchange rate for the US currency, for the dollar, was so high that the prices were up in the sky. I give you another example because this is, I love it. The Apple II, which was the most expensive of the
it's the premium.
Yeah, that was in dollars. It was 1,298 at launch, which amounts to over $6,700 today, and it amounted to a staggering 15,600 Deutschmarks. Now, a VW Käfer, or Beetle, as you might call it, in 1977, in the Cabrio version, which is the better one, with a cigarette lighter as a standard, which is the better one, would have cost you 13,255 Deutschmarks. There you go. That's an Apple computer for you in 1977. So to put this into perspective, why didn't the Germans have like computers when the US people had it in in the end of the 70s and the beginning of the 80s? It is the currency. It was difficult to get a computer for that sum of money. Even if you say it's even complicated in the US because there was no precedent and people didn't know what to expect, imagine the situation in Europe. It was even worse. So I already mentioned that it sold very well. Are there other reasons that come to mind why it would have been successful?
Radio Shack itself. They owned the distribution. They owned Radio Shack, so they could send them to those shops, and then they could buy them. Also, because Radio Shack had all the electronics and was a big player in the electronics, the people that would gravitate, who would want to buy a computer, already are going to these shops. So finding a computer that costs half as much or more than, say, an Apple II would probably go for that, especially if they were thinking of business-related items. I mean, the reason why I picked the Apple II is because of the graphics. However, if I was after an accountant or doing job or work, then it becomes much harder to say whether you want it or not, because they both blip, and the graphics that you do get are functional. They're black and white. And you have, and you can also see, have the numbers, have the killer app, as Apple II would say, would be the quick calc.
Yeah, was it SuperCalc? No, what was it? One of the calculators. Yeah,
essentially the spreadsheet. And the spreadsheet can also be put on it could be on the pet, it could be on the TRS-80 as well. You need to have some extra memory to it. But yeah, you could run that as well. And putting in memory after the fact is also quite possible. And that's what you had a adapter that would give you extra memory. So instead of saying 4K, you could have 20K. And then you can do basic Excel spreadsheets and ledgering and such. And there was also some technology. I have an accounting software package. While it's not leather bound, it has the the soft vinyl to it, and it's three
That you can squeeze. There,
Yeah.
there's the vinyl stuff where there's foam inside and
Yeah.
you can squeeze. Oh,
so not quite leather bound, but it's definitely trying to
the next
imitate
best
it.
thing.
Yeah, it's trying to imitate it. 3 volumes.
Okay.
It has all the software that I want and everything.
Is it on disc or is it on tape?
I think it's on disc.
Okay.
It definitely would come in later. I mean, so I could apply it to the TRS-80 Model 3 that I have. And that one still has the same tube as the Model 1. It's the TV, but it's now a tube that's inside.
We should get to the, to the follow-up generations, but we need to do some of the specifications. You already mentioned it. The standard configuration was 4 kilobytes, which is, if you hear it today, it's absolutely meager, but memory was very expensive.
Yes, it was.
Extremely expensive, and the prices were falling fast. So, like, I mean, 3-4 years later, that would have been
3 or 4 years later. You had the VIC 20 with 16K.
Yeah, it's like
with
four times for less.
And then even a year or two later, you would have the Commodore 64 with 64 active memory.
Yeah.
This
This would have been astronomically expensive in 77. 64 kilobytes would
that's about 8 years.
Have the prices skyrocketing. So 4 kilobytes, which was respectable. You had, as mentioned, a cassette interface with where you could store and load programs. You had this monochrome monitor, which had 64 by 16 text mode. So so that is that. And you had a Zilog Z80, Z80. There's the American for you.
It's called the Z80. However, it could be called the Z80 as well. But that's more of an English term. But it's in America, it's usually called the Z80. I think the Z actually is a better way to say it, but that's beside the point.
Okay, the point is 1.77 megahertz, which is not bad at all. And and you had BASIC in ROM.
Yes.
Which is a big selling point, I think.
Yeah, it was. Because a lot of, even later companies had BASIC in a tape or a cassette. You mentioned the Coleco. Well, their computer, Coleco Atom, you had to run the BASIC off of a tape.
So, I mean, all of the 3 of the Trinity, they had BASIC. I guess Apple, didn't Apple have to deliver it afterwards?
There might have been a glitch, but it had similar BASIC in the sense that it was an integer BASIC. Both the TRS-80 and the Apple II had a basic, which didn't have a whole lot. It didn't have the floating point because that took a lot of space. So it dealt with integer maps, like you said, the 16-bit integer maps. So you could only have values to 65,000. So when it came to doing floating point, you usually needed 32 bits, or essentially double that, and you also needed the mechanisms and the routines to use actual floating point. That took up much more space. So when they did bring out new stuff, or so they upgraded the basic level 2, I think it was 12 kilobytes for it, but that had the ability to handle 32-bit floating point, which most of the basics in that 8-bit era had. And you can still work with 32-bit floating point, but these days you can go up to absurd floating point. But I'm digressing again.
I mean, there's no context of today's. You can't really compare any of that to today's computers. That is that would have been so you could expand this by later buying an expansion interface, which looks very computery, like it is like a box, gray silver appeal, I
Yep,
think.
that
Like,
was the big thing for them was the
yeah, and
gray
you put it
silver.
under the monitor, and it looks good, and it does have a floppy disk controller, an expansion port, a serial port. You could put RAM into that, up to 32K. You had signals. It says signals for a real-time clock. I don't know what you would need a real-time clock for at that
There's
point
actually
in
a
time.
reason. Because of the whole Radio Shack tie-in with the electronics, they actually did a lot of home automation early. You talk about smart homes and figuring things out and timing everything. That was done with Radio Shack equipment then, so 1970s. Now it was very basic and you didn't have any type of feedback. It was all just timers essentially. But you could make a timer for heaters, for lights, all of that back in the 1980s.
Imagine that you have a TRS-80 and you start home automation in the 80s. I mean, in like 1978, 79. That would be, I mean, yeah, talking about cutting edge.
Yeah.
I mean, really, that is a whole different level of.
And you can time it and you can sequence it. I actually have a couple of books on the interfacing the TRS-80 to various tools. There was also a lot of books on doing it with other computers, but the TRS-80 really, because again, it has the Radio Shack angle or the Radio Shack source. So it was already geared. It was already geared for using those electronics with it. Now, I won't say it was compatible because you had to actually do your own soldering, but there was more cross-pollination, if you can understand the term, where you're in the store, you have that, and then you have these components, and then you can find the books for these components to work with it. So while you can't just simply plug it in and go, you can find the resources necessary to do it anyway.
As you're an American, and as you no doubt have been in a Radio Shack store in your life,
Yeah, I have.
do you remember how it was when you first came into such a store? What does it feel like, or what did it feel like?
Oh, interesting mix because the stories that I remember, the first half is for the consumer. So this is where you would have your remote, you would have your general purpose items, your stereos, your various tools, and remote control cars. They were very big on remote control cars. They had it. That was the big thing when I remember. But in the later part, or should I say, in the back of the store, away from necessarily all the stereos and such, you had the raw electronics. So you would have the chips, the resistors. You would have all of the basic electronics that you wanted. You might have some kits. But this is where, if you needed to get a part, you would get from there. So the Radio Shack was sort of mix of, at least in the later years, was a mix of the easy to get straight, you just simply buy and go and take home, to the electronics that you wanted. There was a little bit of a premium because it was all nice and packaged and it had the brand name. I mean, you could always go to a distributor or a non-Radio Shack branded electronics shop and then buy direct that way. You usually get better prices, but you won't get the brand name. And then you'll get some things that are sort of in the middle. But Radio Shack, I remember, had the electronic toys, had the remote control cars. That was one of the big places where you can get half decent electronics. You can get some very cheap stuff, or you can get some fairly expensive remote control cars there. You also had stereo equipment and, of course, TVs.
I mean, it's interesting because they seem to still then have catered to the like the ham radio crowd and all the people who just wanted to tinker with electronics at all.
Yeah.
Which is not how you would imagine a contemporary media market or whatever we have now, which is quite different. Even a cable runs you like triple of what it should cost, and like a cable is like
I've been to Media
a cable is already like advanced stuff. That's already considered something that is advanced.
Yeah,
and
you
could
a cable. Yeah, you get a Hama cable for Hama cable for €10 or something like that.
There you go. And that's already the advanced stuff. I'm not talking about soldering stations or
no, you would never see that.
A cable is already like, and it's been like that for quite a while. I remember that even in the 2000s, like the most advanced thing that you could ask for is a specialized printer cable or something. There is no, you can't buy like I don't know, like boards or stuff to solder something right there. I can't imagine. I can't remember any
I would
of
have
those.
To go up. Yeah, well, yeah. Media Mart had the CDs. You had the appliances. You had a lot of coffee makers. A lot of.
That's right. That's right.
And you had the photos. You had the. It felt more like a Sears or essentially a department. It's a department store.
Maybe
for electronics.
Yeah, maybe my comparison is wrong because we had stores like that in Germany too. But they were called Konrad and Reichelt, and they were
I've heard about this. I would like to go back to.
Yeah,
I would like to go to a Konrad's if they're still around.
I guess that they're all closed right now. I think I read a news on golem.de, which we should mention right here, right now, that the last one's closed too. But
I would have liked to have seen one. I would have liked to have seen one.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I don't know, but Berlin did have at least one. I don't know.
I would like to find it. I would like to find a good electronics store in Berlin.
Hints about this and also future guests and topics to podcast@golem.de, please. Now, back to the story of the TRS-80. So it did start pretty well, and then it did continue to do well.
Yes,
so well, in fact, that there were successors. Yes, as you said, there was you said you have a 3, so there probably was a 2. So what?
Yeah, the 2. Okay, the Model 3 is essentially a Model 1 with the memory, so it has 48 kilobytes instead of 4. It has the basic level 2, so it had the floating point. It has a built-in monitor, which is still the same monitor as the level. It's the TV, but it's just the tube this time. The tube and some of the electronics to deconstruct. And it has 2 floppy disks, or 5 1/4, or essentially the standard 5 1/4 Stuttgart design. Now the Model 2 had less memory. I think it was 32 kilobytes. But had 8-inch Stuttgart drives. And then there was the Model 4, which I think had refinements and also I think a high definition graphics, something that was lacking with the other models. They had fairly simple, so it was 128 by 48 pixels that you can get access to, while more common machines, especially when the 80s started to come around, had like 192 or 256 or 300 versus. So the graphics needed to be improved. So that's where the Model 4 came in to be. There was also the color computers, which already had, essentially, those were the home lines for more gameplay for the gamer that would essentially compete against the Commodore 64 and the Commodore VIX.
So were they compatible?
No.
Oh, of course not.
It's
the 80s we're talking about. Of course they're not compatible.
The 8-bit era of computers, there was very little direct compatibility. Yeah, even between typical machines. You actually have examples right here. You have a Commodore 64 or 128, and then you have a
Oh, I wish it was a 28, but it's a 128. It's a Commodore 64.
Okay,
Yeah, and
64.
it's a +4. Yeah,
and then you have the +4, and
Yeah.
you have the Commodore 16.
yeah.
They're not compatible.
No.
Same company, and almost the same look.
No. Okay. You got me there. You got me there, Richard. But they are not called They are not called C16 Model 1, 2, and 3. They have different names, and you
Those are compatible. Now
Okay.
the models, the Commodore, the TRS-80 is compatible. Model 1, Model 2, Model 3,
That's
Model
what
4
yeah.
are compatible.
Okay.
It was when I introduced the color computer, the Coco,
Okay.
that I'll say, that's not compatible because it uses a completely different architecture and actually a different processor entirely. But it's not the nice, pretty, or I should say, the black and white ones that I have.
But the Model 2 it looks entirely different than the Model 1. It looks much, I would say, sleeker, but I'm not sure what they were going for with this one. It has the TV style aesthetics with the non-centered screen, but on the right there is a disk drive,
Yep.
which makes sense, I guess. And then you have a separate keyboard, which does it house the computer, the keyboard? Or is it in the
If in the Model 3 that I have, no, it does not. The computer is actually in the back
of the
with
screen,
the model
of the screen?
of the screen.
Yeah.
The Model 1, it is. It's very similar. The Model 1 and the Commodore 64 are very close in the sense of the form, that you have a keyboard above the computer. So in the Model 1, it is there. It is above the computer. So you would be typing essentially on the computer itself. The Model 2, I'm unsure. It could be using a line, essentially a very thick cable that goes to the machine. I suspect that they might be doing the same thing as the Model 3 and have the computer in the back and then just have a wire that goes to the keyboard.
We had the TRS-80. We had the TRS-80 models that followed. None of which, to my knowledge, came to Europe with any success. Did they?
I don't recall. The TRS-80s actually aren't well known even in the United States. They were superseded by Commodore and by the Apple and the IBM. They were still around in the late 80s, but because Tandy switched over to the IBMs with the Tandy 1000 and its brand, the predecessor, or in this case the TRS-80s, fell away. They were never really loved. They were convenient in the sense that they were cheap, they did the job, but no one had the love they didn't have the passion that some of the others did, because you had the Commodore and you had, which was fairly passionate for a lot of people because it was their first computer and it was also a gaming computer. So the kids like myself would gravitate to the Commodore, even though you kind of look at basics, and the Commodore 64 Basic was terrible. But you didn't have that sort of emotional tie with the TRS-80. And then when as you would with the Apple II. Now, I think the Apple II had a little bit more because you essentially had Jobs and Wozniak. And you also paid this very high amount for this pretty thing. So you kind of felt like you had to fight for it.
Also, it had a lot going for it, like you already mentioned it. It had expansion capabilities. It was a really good computer that it shouldn't be underestimated. Back to the TRS-80.
Sure.
You said software. Now, what we skipped was games. Are there any games?
Yes, there are.
Games?
There are some good games. There's also some demonstration games. There was one called The Dancing Demon. That's considered one of the more a favorite that I see a lot in the chats because I think it has some of the better animation. There's actually a flight simulator too. There's that actually did 3D graphics. So while you couldn't have the detail, with the Apple II, you did have that. There were some graphics like that. Then pretty much all the text games. Like the Zorks definitely were moved over because that's relatively easy to do. So text-based games, Infocom probably was there. What other ones? But there really wasn't a whole lot of games on the TRS-80s themselves. That was moved over to the color computers. Those are where a lot of the games were played. So you would have your Munchers and so forth. Now, there were some games that were brought back, but games were never a thing for the TRS-80. It was never considered a game machine. It was a very business-oriented machine.
Okay, so this is probably also a reason, as you said, for it being a more obscure and forgotten computer, because you don't have emotional ties to it. If you don't have emotional ties to it, and it's just a small computer from the beginning of the 80s. I mean, it obviously sold reasonably well. It made an impact at least for its company, for Radio Shack to continue producing computers. You said they transitioned to PC compatibles, and they also removed Radio Shack from the name. And there's one, I mean, I don't know if it's true, but one take on that is that they wanted to get rid of the name Radio Scrap or Trash 80, which were synonyms for these computers.
Right, because they didn't have the personal or the public view that, say, the Atari or the Commodore had. And the Trash 80 is a common trope, is because it didn't have the pretty graphics, it didn't have the look, and it was considered a substandard computer. Even though it worked perfectly fine, it had all the necessary tools to do it, and for a business owner, it can do a lot. And of course, it did something that most of the others didn't do, and that was the home automation side of things, because of its tie with Radio Shack. Yeah, actually the Tandies for a while actually proved very useful. The Tandy 1000, the PC compatibles, they were actually pushing things a little. They pushed some of the boundaries because the IBM at the time, the IBM PC, didn't have great graphics, didn't have any of that, but the Tandy 1000 did. That's why you have the Tandy standard. When you look at early PC graphics, you'll see Tandies there. That's because Tandy pushed for more colors in this 320, this space that usually is with the CGA. It went past that and was considered a viable option for computer graphics in the early 80s with the IBM compatibles.
Before we come to the model that you brought with you, because of course you couldn't bring the Model 1 with you for space for luggability reasons. I would say you do have one with you. But before we come to that, final thing. So if someone who's listening to this podcast wants to relive the TRS-80 days, what are the options today? I mean, obviously, you said you brought yours from the US. So if for example, I'll go to Las Vegas in January. If I could pick up one and bring it here, it would be, even if someone would give the computer to me for free, it would be very, very expensive to get it here, and very it was
the shipping would be high.
So
150 to 200 euros just to ship.
So and we already established that there is probably not a high there's not a high chance to find one used on eBay in Europe, or is there?
Well, let me say one thing about that.
Okay.
The power supply that I got for my Model 1, the one that I just found, is a European plug. So they're out there somewhere.
They're out there somewhere.
If you are interested in hunting one down, I suspect you could find one.
I see one. I see one on eBay.
Yeah.
It's 200 euros and it's just the keyboard.
Yeah. And then you
obviously,
just simply have to hook it up. But that you might have to have an interface. I don't know if it's the keyboard or if it's the Model 1, because there is an interface. It does need to be tied to the monitor.
Okay, and I see a user manual for 40 euros. So if you don't have anything, you at least have that. But what are the real options right now? Is there emulation?
Yes, there is. There is definitely a lot of emulation for that. So you can go in and check things out. I'm thinking about I might use an emulator just to program some basic, because it's the editing on computer is interesting because it doesn't allow you to edit at all the places, but you can edit the line, a line of code, and it is very deep in the sense that you have a lot of controls in that editing. But it is if you do not have a manual, it is very confusing and it becomes a problem.
So the 40 euros are probably justified for the manual. I don't know. So is there anything, if you have such a computer, some computers, they have known weak spots. Mm-hmm. They know the capacitors are all, Oh. Is there something like that is known to you?
Not that I know of for the capacitor. It's not. I haven't seen any weak capacitors.
So you didn't have to do any maintenance on your models because they just turn on and work?
Yeah, they were turned on. I could check. Old capacitors definitely leak over time. I probably could spend like a half a year or a full year just replacing the capacitors in all the systems I have.
There are cases like the Amiga, I think it's 600 and 1200, where you have to swap a lot of parts because they're known to all break down. So
I did a replacement on a 1200. I have a 1200, Amiga 1200. And yes, I had to replace all the capacitors.
So that's what I mean. That's more like the kind of thing that I mean. But if there is no such weak spot, then all the better.
I don't think so.
Yeah, great.
They weren't cutting as many. I guess the components were better built back then. I don't know. You can make that assumption.
Yeah. On the other hand, there are these notorious reefer capacitors, which definitely are.
Yes, thank you for reminding me about the reefers.
So
because I did replace them on my TRS-80 Model 3, because the power supplies, while the rest of the power supply is fine, the reefers definitely, because I could see the cracking. So I replaced those. I forgot about that. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, the reefers, you probably could get away with not having them there, but I had a friend who had some, so I asked for it.
Now we come to the first computer that we mentioned, the first TRS-80 that we mentioned in this podcast an age ago, when we started it. It is the TRS-80 Model 100. And I said it's neither TRS nor is it 80. Mm-hmm. I said it's not TRS because it's actually a model from a Japanese company called Kyocera.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And it's not 80 because it doesn't have a Z80 in it, but it has like a CPU in it that has an 80 in it. It seems to be an Intel 8085, which is a strange...
That sounds like an Intel.
That's a strange chip. So it's a portable computer. And not only that, it is really portable. It's pocketable even. It is, I think you could have like...
maybe in a backpack.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Yeah. So it is very light. I am like holding it right now, and you can hold it in one hand. It is a overly thick iPad. It's
you could say that, yeah.
Yeah, it's a very thick iPad with a keyboard.
And it is it's a bit heavier than my very lightweight normal notebook with 1.3 kilograms. That is not much. I guess that's without batteries.
I feel like this would be close to about just a kilo, but
Okay.
off.
Okay, I'm just reading what it says here, and it's running on 4 AA batteries, which is amazing for next to 20 hours.
Yeah, for about 20 hours. It will. It's that there are no the LED the display is very classic LCD.
Non-backlit.
Non-backlit. It has the standard LCD ghosting. You can change the contrast, but yeah, it was very good for reporters back in the 1980s because they could carry it around and then type in their correspondence, and it has an RS-232 port, so they could send that information out.
And it also has a good keyboard.
Yeah, it has a nice.
There you go.
It has a very nice physical keyboard. The mechanical keyboards that everybody likes to talk about.
Now, and if we said that the TRS-80, the original, was a success, this one was even more. Because it was sold under different brands, they shipped around 6 million of them in total worldwide, which means, in opposition to the TRS-80 that we talked about in this podcast, you can actually go and buy one right now. For not a whole lot of money. I mean, everything is expensive today if it's retro, but it's possible to find one of these, and they usually work. And I think it's a nice, it's a nice.
If you wanted to get into that, and this is probably a very good start. You don't have to worry about hertz or voltages too much. All you have to do is pop in some batteries. You will have to deal with cassettes or finding a way to get data in and out of it. However, that's all.
Now, there are some caveats. One of them is this computer cannot count above the year 2000. So whatever you do,
yes.
you should make sure that it happens before the year 2000, which is generally a good kind of advice, I think.
I could see it having the problem that would be baked into the ROM, but it does have the ability to have extra ROMs. There is a switch.
It also comes with BASIC, so it's a computer that you can, you can get some basic skills.
Yep.
And it is in a certain point, it has some historic value in Germany because there was a hack in the 80s. It's called the BTX hack. Have you ever heard of that?
No, I haven't.
There was a kind of online service that the Deutsche Post had. It was called BTX for Bildschirmtext, like screen text. And you could log in. And the CCC, the hacking club in Germany, they wanted to prove that it is unsafe, so that you can hack into it and you can read personal data, which the Post said isn't possible.
Oops.
But they obviously managed to get into the account of a bank, but not in their banking account, but into their BTX account, and then they had the bank call their website, whatever it is called, like the site that they had, which was billing them for $9.99 every time.
Wow.
So, and there was a point in the whole hack where this had to be automated. The bank had to, automatically. And that was done with a TRS-80 Model 100. Which I never knew, but I found out doing the research for this episode. It's strange. Okay, Richard, thank you so much for being here and talking with me about the TRS-80. Thank all of you for listening so long to us. I don't know how long this podcast is. I don't know. We'll have a last coffee today, I think. And if you want to meet Richard, you'll be on the next Vintage Computing Festival.
Oh, yeah,
Is
easily.
that? Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm a regular at our monthly and bi-monthly meeting, retro meets. We do a retro meet where essentially a bunch of us friends get together and just hang out. We do old computers. Literally, actually, tomorrow, I plan to go down to a place called eLab or Berlin Creators. And that is where we just simply put together old computers and just play with them. So I'll probably bring my Coco 2 computer there because I want to see if I can get it. I want to install a mod so that I can display more than just the R signal that's there. And then 3 weeks from now, at the last Saturday of each month, we have an Amiga meet where we set up Amigas. Generally, but any computer can be brought in, and we'll be happy to help if you have problems with it or if you just want to say hi.
So we'll put links to all of that in the show notes. So if you're in Berlin or the Berlin area, just drop by the VCFB, which is a year from now, I guess. It's quite a long time till the next VCFB, I reckon. But all the other stuff is happening. And if you want to read anything about retro media in general, it is probably a good idea to look at golem.de. I'm not sure how many people who listen to this are Germans. I'm not even sure where this podcast is going to fit in the whole podcast thing that I'm doing, but we'll find out together. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you, Richard, and see you next time.